Welcome to Canvas of the Heart, presented by Free Arts for Abused Children of Arizona. The mission of Free Arts is to transform children's trauma to resilience through the arts. This show is a collection of conversations that spotlight the ways free arts creates hope for children and teens who've experienced abuse, neglect, or homelessness. We hope you find this show to be informative, inspiring, and fun. Hi, Jenna.
Hi, Matt.
Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
I think we have a huge opportunity here to educate our audience about one of the key factors that makes free arts what it is. Mm-hmm. I want to talk about trauma. And at first, I'd want to give you a chance to introduce yourself and tell us a bit about your clinical background, because you're the clinical director for Free Arts.
Yes, I am. So my clinical background actually begins with my bachelor's in psychology. And I just always was fascinated with why do we do what we do? What governs or what drives human behavior? And from there, I found a love and appreciation for family therapy and recognizing that we as humans do not operate in a vacuum. We are always being influenced by everyone around us. So that led me to marriage and family therapy. And through my clinical practice there, working in the school systems up in Philadelphia, working in the psychiatric hospitals in Philadelphia as well, I started to realize a lot of these families are having issues coping or addressing their community-based needs. And that's really what led me down the path of social work and understanding what are the barriers, what are the community-based resources that are available, why is it so difficult to obtain them? And so I spent some time went down to Orlando, to University of Central Florida, and we did some work down there with the medical hospital systems and then some end-of-life care. I tend to have to follow my clients throughout all the phases of their lives. Mm-hmm. And so it led me into working with hospice. And so I found that of all of the different populations that I worked with, kids just captured my heart. Young people just really captured my heart, and particularly teens. And so that led me into doing some work in the Bahamas at the juvenile detention facility, and then on to the children's home there on one of the family islands. And then, as fate would have it, it landed me in Phoenix doing even more work with children who've experienced trauma.
Yeah, that's interesting. You started with like a focus on being interested in why we do what we do, right? Like, mm-hmm. Why do humans act and react and mm-hmm. take the steps that they do? And then growing into an environmental question. Mm-hmm. We're not isolated. Mm-hmm. Often what we're coping with, how we're showing up, how we're mm-hmm. behaving, right? That's, I guess, a good word for teens and children, although adults behave too. Mm-hmm. It is a mix between, what's inside and their environment. Mm-hmm. One of the environmental things which has brought us to this episode is the effect of traumatic experiences on young people. Those can be standalone incidents, or they can be built into the environment. And I'm wondering if you could tell us, almost from your clinical experience, what is trauma? What should people in the community know about trauma?
Yeah, I think there's a really big kind of misconception about what trauma is. If you come from a medical background, you tend to think of trauma in terms of something physical to the body. And sometimes I think it's very difficult for the general public to understand trauma from a mental health perspective, because if your bone is broken, you broke your arm, you can see that. You can see, okay, there's pain, there's swelling, there could be blood, there's something happening. But if I'm trying to explain that mentally I'm having challenges, mentally I'm having difficulties, it's kind of hard for people to conceptualize that because they can't actually see what's happening in my brain. It might be shown through my behavior, but they can't see it. So when we're talking about trauma from a mental health perspective, we're talking about the effect that a particular experience has had on us. So you have an event, or maybe you've witnessed an event, or you've seen it somewhere. It doesn't have to happen to you. It could have been something that you've witnessed, but your reaction to it is very long-standing. It's a negative reaction. It's a challenge that you're experiencing where that event has disrupted your everyday life. It has disrupted your ability to go about all of your daily duties. It's disrupting everything, whether it's how you perceive certain things in your environment, how you react, how you act moving forward. All of those things are disrupted. So when we're saying trauma, it can be something along the lines of a minor fender bender. And so now I have anxiety every time I get into the car.
That one's fear-based, right? It's the moment of fear that has overloaded us.
Yes. And so now it's like, I can't do it. Maybe I'm shaking. Maybe I'm sweating. It's like, okay, this is becoming very, very difficult for me. Or trauma could extend all the way to experiencing something life-threatening, experiencing a certain type of assault where now your livelihood, your ability to survive is now being threatened. Mm-hmm. And so we talk about trauma. We're talking about an entire spectrum of different events, and understanding that you and I can go through a similar experience, and I can come out traumatized and you could not, or vice versa. So it's how we have an ability to cope with that event. What protective factors maybe could have been in place that could have prevented you from being traumatized by that event, whereas I may not have had those and now I am traumatized.
We think of trauma as you defined it with children and teens. It's very clearly around abuse incidents. Mm-hmm. But I wonder how neglect itself can be a form of trauma.
Yeah, so you're very right. When we think of it, we're thinking of something physical and maybe even like the emotional part of it. But when a child or anybody faces any form of neglect, that definitely has an impact as well, because your basic needs are not being met. So it is still putting your body and your mind in like survival mode. You're not able to thrive and live your life because do you even know where your next meal is coming from if it's a food scarcity? Do you even know how you're supposed to function in the world if you're not even having access to education? How is your physical life going to be if you're not being able to access medical resources? So neglect is very, very intertwined with poverty, unfortunately, and the different social inequities that exist within our communities. Neglect is very highly connected with the problems that we have on a societal level with the inability to access so many different resources that we need for our livelihood. And so sometimes we tend to look at it as, is it neglect because of a lack of responsibility on the parents' part? Like they did not assume the necessary responsibilities? Or is it just the fact that they cannot access, they don't know where to go, they don't have the support networks in place to guide them to where they're supposed to be? Right.
And I think it's important for you to point out like the social impact of poverty around neglect, because often that type of poverty is generational, right? Yes. It's very difficult to break out of it. Often in the school setting, we tell people education is the pathway, but even education itself is not free. So poverty has an effect that is easy to quantify when you look at what are disparities. And unfortunately, it's hard to look at that reality because children haven't done anything to deserve that, and yet they experience it. Right. So that said, if you're encountering someone that's young, a child or teen that's experienced trauma, what's going on with them behaviorally? What would be the signs? How would that show up at school, maybe at home, in their relationships?
Yes. So one thing that I remember learning in my studies that I have carried with me throughout my career that I try to explain to families and any people who are in the child welfare field is that when you see that there's a child who is misbehaving or having behavioral challenges in a particular environment, look in the opposite environment for the source of the problem. Children have a tendency to display adverse behaviors in the environment in which they feel the safest. So when you're looking at a child who is acting out, as a lot of teachers would say, acting out in school, or they're misbehaving in school, chances are there's a problem in the home. And some of the things that they may see are the insubordination. I told you to sit down, you don't want to sit down.
Defiance.
Yes. They're saying, okay, you're not doing your homework. They're saying that you're being a class clown, you're being disruptive. So those are some of the things that you can see even in a school setting. But in a home setting, you can see the aggression, you can see crying, you can see self-isolation. If there's a child who has reach their developmental milestones, you might even see something like bedwetting. You know, there's a regression of those developmental milestones. So trauma can manifest and look as so many different things in the lives of children. And oftentimes you find that they're misinterpreted by the adults in their life. So when you're looking at even substance abuse, maybe in teens, self-injurious behavior, all of these are signs that there is some type of trauma that has gone unaddressed that needs to be addressed.
Because underneath it, those are coping mechanisms.
Exactly. That's what it comes down to. There is an analogy that I gave for some individuals when we were having a discussion, a training on self-injurious behaviors. A child who would engage in something of that nature will use that, whatever mechanism they choose, will use it as a form of coping because they receive relief from whatever they're experiencing within that moment. But because the root of the problem has not been addressed, when the trigger comes back, they go to what they know works. Even if it's only temporary, they go to what they know because that's their survival method because they haven't been taught anything else. So it's all about finding healthy coping mechanisms to replace the unhealthy ones. Right. Because right now we have a culture that says you have to stop this, stop drinking, stop smoking, stop running away, stop hurting yourself. But we're not giving anything in its place.
Right.
And we're not addressing the trigger. We're not addressing the event that has led them to do it. So before you can tell a child to eliminate a behavior, give them a replacement one in the mix.
That helps them cope.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly. And that's what has been a lot of the missing piece, the pieces when it comes to trying to help children address their trauma.
Yeah. You mentioned self-harm, self-injury. I wonder if you just might tell us a bit more about that. I think it is something a lot of adults are aware of because of young people in their life or things they see or hear about it. And there can be some misconceptions, right? The fancy term is like parasuicidal injury, which is it looks serious, but it's not actually an attempt. But it is still damaging. We're talking light cutting, that self-harm itself. Fill us in a bit more about what's happening for our audience when they hear about that and what the misconceptions might be about that kind of behavior. Yeah,
I think one of the biggest misconceptions is that it's done for attention.
Okay.
That is probably one of the biggest things, especially when the most commonly known method of cutting oneself, thinking that, okay, well, if they really wanted to do it, they would have cut the other way. You hear stuff like that, and it really just shows how much of a disconnect there is between what the actual situation is and what people's understanding of it. And when there's that type of disconnect, there's a disconnect in how do you properly address it. So that's only one of the ways that young people can engage in self-injurious behaviors, but it's not limited to that.
Yeah.
You have individuals who just will hit themselves as a means to distract themselves from whatever the trigger is. You have the hair pulling. I've worked with teenagers who have no eyebrows, teenagers who have literally picked a bald spot into their scalp. There are so many different ways that people can engage in this type of behavior. And one of the key things about it when it comes to is this a cry for attention is that there's a level of shame and embarrassment. Yeah. It's the fact that young people don't want you to know. That's why they hide it. I remember working alongside with some teenagers where unless you did a strip search, you never would have seen. you never would have seen anything. No scarring or anything. And so that, I think, is another piece, is that if it was for attention, would it be so openly displayed? And a lot of the times it's not. A lot of the times it's something that's really hidden because it is very personal. And it's not that, oh, this is what I want to do. It's that I don't know what else to do, and this is what has worked.
Yeah, that's important information, and I think an important context when we think about the ways that teenagers, young adults show up and the things that they talk about that may or may not be part of our audience's lived experience. So it's a tough one to understand. I'm wondering if you could tell us a bit more about, as children age, from children to teens and then into adulthood, what effect does trauma have on them as people, and how does it affect their relationships?
Yes, unaddressed trauma has such significant impacts on individuals as they get older. You know, as a child, you have your own issues with learning how to regulate your mood, how to interact with one another, even the effects that it has on your learning. But as you get older, those situations start to increase, they exacerbate. So then you're looking at the unhealthy coping mechanisms, turning to substances or engaging in very unhealthy practices. And then that ends up having a significant toll on your overall physical health. Yeah. So then when we talk about adverse childhood experiences, what some people may know as ACEs, we talk about how trauma affects your physical health moving forward, because you have situations where you're more likely to develop long-term chronic illnesses as to the, in comparison to those who have not had these experiences. And so as you move forward, when they've been unaddressed, your life expectancy, unfortunately, decreases. Yes. And so when we talk about trauma, it's not just in your head. It's now the fact that the behaviors associated with that are now making their way into your overall lifestyle. And it keeps you in a cycle of, I have not addressed this trauma. I don't know how to address this trauma. So now here I am experiencing certain behaviors or exhibiting certain behaviors. And all of this is having a significant impact on my physical health. And when it has an impact on your physical health and you're engaging in unhealthy practices, it has a negative impact on your social relationships. So now we're finding that as you get older, the attachment styles, when you don't have secure attachment, that's not going to be very healthy in the long run. So when you're trying to find a partner, but you have abandonment issues, so now you're very clingy, as they like to say. You're
chronically ready for them to leave you.
Yes. And so sometimes you unintentionally push them away because you're constantly accusing them of leaving you. Exactly. And then you have other types of attachment where I'm so independent. I don't need anyone. Nobody has ever been there for me before. So what do I need from you? Nothing. And so then that also creates a barrier to finding healthy relationships as well. And so then you find yourself in an overall toxic cycle, just going back and around like a merry-go-round, trying to find some type of relief, trying to get off that carousel. And you end up not being able to do so, because of unaddressed childhood trauma.
Right. So, big question that people spend their lives and careers devoted to is, once we identify trauma, we know that it's part of our life perhaps, or someone we care about. What helps? And how does free arts help?
So, when we talk about what helps, one of the number one things we say is, oh, you got to go to therapy. Yeah. You got to go to therapy. And there are so many different types of modalities out there. You have your CBT, you have your ACT. You can pick, choose, and refuse all the different therapeutic modalities that you have. But one of the strongest things that I think is that you have to have the willpower to want to go through the process, right? And you have to have that in terms of recognizing what you contributed to, what you did not contribute to, right, and where are you going to go from here? So it's actively putting in the work. I think there's a misconception for those outside of the mental health community that going to therapy solves everything. Right. And it doesn't, because you actually have to actively work at the principles that you and your clinician are talking about.
Right. The goal of good therapy is that you learn to do the process on your own and act it out, right? You're getting a curated version of another person.
Yes.
That is very much tied into you, responds, mirrors, validates you, so that you can know what that feels like. Correction of that, all those past relationships and incidents. And then you hopefully take it forward and you provide that and experience it with other people.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. That's exactly what it's all about. And so when you take those principles and you apply it to the different relationships outside of that therapeutic environment, that's when you're starting to really build your resilience. And one of the things that when it comes to what are the effects of childhood trauma on anybody is the inability to regulate your emotions, right? So you have these extremes. Sometimes, it's an extreme high, it's an extreme low. And so one of the things that definitely helps is learning regulation. Starting off with learning that co-regulation, like how do you co-regulate with a supportive person? And that's what a lot happens like in therapy is like, okay, I'm learning I'm bringing myself down. Now we're mirroring, okay, so let's woosah. Let's bring this back down. It's okay. Let's look at things rationally, because that's another effect of trauma is the inability to look at things from a rational perspective. Yeah. It's an inability to see things for what they are without attributing all of the negative emotions or forecasting onto the situation. So you learn to co-regulate. And then the goal is to be able to regulate on your own, is to be able to self-regulate during the times that you need it, and to recognize that the situation that is before you is manageable. So it's not about erasing all of the negative experiences in your life, because unfortunately we don't have control over a lot of those things, but it's about being able to see a situation for what it is and recognize that you within yourself have the tools to overcome that situation, to face it head on and overcome it in a healthy manner.
It's powerful. It's powerful. As we close up here, I wonder if you could give us a sense of where we could find hope in the midst of the traumatic things that either we experience or for the children or teens that we know in our lives that have been through difficult things. What gives people hope?
I think what gives people hope is multiple things, right? I think sometimes people can dig deep down inside themselves and find the hope, but then I think also at times they may not be able to recognize it so easily. It's always there. They may not be able to recognize it so easily. So they see it in other people. And I think that's part of what Free Arts does, is that we show that we, I guess, embody that hope that they're seeking and that they're looking for. And so when we work with individuals, when we work with children or we work with families, we show them the positive side. We show them that they can be brave, they can be resilient, they can be creative, they can be all of these things that they already had, but just nobody tapped into. So that hope really comes from them. That hope comes from the community. That hope comes from the social interactions that are positive, that are supportive in their lives. That's where all of that hope comes from. So to be able to say that it's from one single source, I think is inaccurate. Because I think hope is anywhere you can look for it. It's anywhere you can see it. Maybe it's even in someone that you have never met before. But just recognizing or hearing their story and being able to see some type of similarity within what you've experienced and what that individual has experienced. And just recognizing that I don't have to be defined by my experience, but I can be empowered through the experience.
Excellent. Well, Jenna, thank you very much for coming on today.
Thank you so much for having me. Yes, This was a wonderful conversation. I appreciate the opportunity.
And we appreciate your work here and the expertise you add into the work that we do, making it as impactful as possible. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Canvas of the Heart. We'd love to hear your questions and feedback by email at hello@freeartsaz.org. You can find more information about Free Arts by visiting our website at freeartsaz.org. We'd like to thank the many individual and corporate donors and the hundreds of volunteers that make Free Arts programs possible. Take care, and we will talk to you soon.